Good morning, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Je m'appelle Talib Nur Mohammed. My name is Talib Nur Mohammed. I am the Member of Parliament for Vancouver Granville. And before we begin, it is my great honor to invite to the podium Sequoia Anuhonik and Chief Wayne Sparrow from Tsleil-Waututh and Musqueam to help us start off in a good way.
Go ahead, you go first with the prayer and I'll...
On health and squalwin, quis clake, quachnomi, tenoyapen and sequedo, to squals to seats, sequalia quashaman sna, and wanik queen sna, schahot majochameok chen. I welcome each and every one of you today to this beautiful day and important announcement that's taking place. I'm Sequalia, also known as Anne Wanik from the Squamish Nation. I'm a counselor and one of the spokespersons, and I welcome you to our shared territories of Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and to Tsleil-Waututh. So I raise my hands to all of you. Today we're gathered for a very important topic about the climate change and action plans and being involved as Indigenous people and the knowledge that we can contribute in regards to going not to Queequeg in the long ago. Everything we know about the land, water, and air is now happening to be able to contribute to action plans and our Indigenous knowledge. So it's an honor to be here today, and I just want you to all open your hands. Don't block the energy, the force. And we'll say, Chenkwe mentomi kakakanak chesiam, yons yonso tenoyap and manman squalwin to squals to seats. Asking you, Creator, to watch over and guide all your children today and help them with their squalwin feelings in their hearts and minds, their emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual health and wellness. And asking you, Creator, also to let today be a Yetwan Halt Zaitz an excellent work, and see us all safely home at the end of the day. Tama Kwitsi Snatchum.
Siam, Siaya, Ichwael, Siam. My name is Wayne Sparrow. I'm the elected chief of Musqueam First Nation. My traditional name is Yakalak. I just want to thank our auntie, our elder, for opening us up in a good way. It's very important that we make our presence today, and I want to acknowledge the ministers and the city for acknowledging and following protocol. I'm here with our staff, Igani, that, you know, when Musqueam, as First Nations people, the environment and the climate and the habitat has always been very important to First Nations people. In Musqueam, we're a fishing community. Always have been, always will be. And hopefully, Mr. Wilkinson, when you were fisheries minister, made some drastic changes to help protect some of our salmon. Once again, I want to acknowledge all your work there, you know, for the government to come out and make those hard decisions. But the decisions are for the future, and it's not just for today. So once again, I want to acknowledge you. I also want to acknowledge Igane, who's now, as we've been growing in our community to look after all of these important issues, we've now opened up our environment stewardship department, and being briefed by Igane that Musqueam wants to be ahead of the municipalities and the federal on net zero and the climate change. So once again, it's a privilege and honor to be here, and I want to acknowledge all the hard work that the government's doing. I always say as First Nations people that we're here for our next generation to make sure the benefits that we have here are going to be left for our children, for not just the First Nations people, but the people in the country and the province and the city. So once again, Haichka, and I want to acknowledge Igani for all of her hard work that she does and the leadership that she does on behalf of our community so that we can accomplish those goals. Good to see everybody here, and I do have to leave almost right away. Speaking of fishing, I gotta go out on my boat, but I hope everybody has a great summer, and thanks for all the hard work that you do in acknowledgement. Haichka Siam, thank you.
Chen Quinman told me I'm grateful and thankful to each and every one of you, and glad to have the ministers acknowledge us and allow us to start the proceedings today in a good way. Tama Kwetsi Snachim. Those are my words.
Well, Thank you so much for starting us off in a good way. Sequalia from Squamish and from Chief Wayne Sparrow from Musqueam, and Chief Thomas from Tsleil-Waututh may be joining us later, but she was unable to join us at the beginning of the program. We're here today to talk about the reality of climate change and how we can respond together. And as we've just heard from our elders, there is a lot for us to learn in terms of how we think about working in collaboration and harmony with nature, and how we respond to the challenges that we have, not just with new technology, but also learning from what Indigenous communities have taught us in the past. And I think that's an important lesson for all of us as we think about the challenges that we have faced over the last number of years, not just here in British Columbia, but across this country. And I reflect on our learnings that Minister Blair and I had when we were on the Sumas Prairie. And if only past generations had listened. So I think there's a lot for all of us to learn. And we know that climate change affects everyone, whether it's rising sea levels, smoke from forest fires, extreme heat, disrupted supply chain, the impact on health. These are just few of the impacts that we all feel and that we're feeling across this country and here in my riding of Vancouver Granville. So that's why this announcement today is so important for all of us. It's important for us to recognize that having a whole of society approach to help us plan for and adapt to the worst impacts of climate change and to respond in a way that allows future generations to have the clean air and water and land that they deserve. And so I'm really excited and very, very grateful that we are all gathered together today in your presence and with your good wishes to begin us in this way. And this announcement really is about the recognition that all of us at all levels of government and within the federal government need to be working together, we need to be working hand in hand, and we need to approach this complex issue in a way that recognizes its urgency, that recognizes its opportunity in terms of how we respond, what it means for the future of our economy, for the future of our health, for the future of our planet, indeed for the future of our children and grandchildren. So it is my great pleasure and privilege to invite to the podium now my dear friend, the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, the Honorable Steven Guilbeault.
Thank you so much, Talib. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. I would like to start by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territory of the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. Thank you for the opening prayer and the opening remarks to get us started in a good way. J'aimerais également remercier mes collègues, le ministre des Ressources naturelles, l'honorable Jonathan Wilkinson, et le ministre de la Protection civile, l'honorable Bill Blair, qui ont été des alliés de tous les instants dans le développement de cette stratégie. J'aimerais également saluer le maire adjoint de Vancouver, Mike Klassen, le ministre de l'Environnement et de la stratégie contre les changements climatiques de la Colombie-Britannique, l'honorable George Amon. And as Talib has just said, Canada's climate is changing. Most of you here have felt the impacts or have friends and family who've been affected by wildfires, floods, extreme heat, drought, and other climate impacts. We see more severe climate impact with each passing year, with each passing season, like this year's rash of spring wildfires in BC, Alberta, Quebec, Nova Scotia, Saskatchewan, and the Northwest Territories. More intense fires earlier in the year and in almost every province and territory at the same time. This extreme weather is unprecedented. While we must reduce our emissions to keep the climate from getting worse, we must also make our communities more resilient to the impacts of climate change. That's why today we're launching Canada's first ever National Adaptation Strategy. This strategy is the result of 2 years of engagement with stakeholders and partners across the country, including provincial, territorial, and municipal governments, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis representatives, key experts and stakeholders, and Canadians from across the country. In short, this is a whole-of-society plan to reduce the risk and prepare communities for climate impacts. La stratégie est bien plus qu'un simple engagement à travailler ensemble. Elle contient des cibles et des objectifs précis, and those objectives aimed at reducing the impacts of climate change, protect the health of well-beings of Canadians, to protect nature and biodiversity, to to build more resilient infrastructure, and to favor a strong economy while supporting workers. Comme plusieurs d'entre vous le savent, cette stratégie a été initialement publiée en novembre dernier et les provinces, les territoires et les nations autochtones nationales ont eu le temps de l'examiner et de demander des changements. La version définitive de la stratégie renforce l'engagement à faire participer l'ensemble des communautés tout en conservant la vision globale, les principes directeurs et les objectifs qui illustrent bien la force de ce document. Now we move to implementation. How we adapt depends on where we are in the country, so the actions we take will often be at the local and regional levels. While this is the first national adaptation strategy, many communities, governments, businesses, nations have already developed their own adaptation plan to prepare for the risks that a changing climate will bring. I commend your leadership and your foresight. In the coming months, agreements between the federal government and provinces and territories will be explored as one way to implement the strategy. The Indigenous climate leadership process will advance self-determined climate adaptation strategies by First Nation, Inuit, and Métis. And the Green Municipal Fund will continue to support municipalities with the additional funds available to communities starting in 2024. Since 2015, the Government of Canada has made more than $10 billion in adaptation investment and disaster assistance. This includes $2 billion in funding commitments since fall of 2022 to support the National Adaptation Strategy and other adaptation activities such as flood mapping and access to flood insurance. Finally, to the members of the advisory tables for the National Adaptation Strategy, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, the Insurance Bureau of Canada, Indigenous leaders from across the country, businesses, communities, health association, NGOs, and everyone else, and many of you are here with us today, thank you. Thank you for coming together to create a document that will guide us to a more resilient and safe future. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Minister Guilbeault, for your very thoughtful and prescient words. As everyone knows, Minister Guilbeault has been a long time and very passionate advocate for making sure we think about our planet and the consequences of climate change. And he is joined in this venture in many ways by someone who needs no introduction, but I get to introduce him anyways. Jonathan, the Honorable Jonathan Wilkinson, who is the Minister of Natural Resources, because part of our understanding of how we address the issue of climate change is, of course, how we manage our resources. And Minister Wilkinson brings a profoundly wide range of experiences and skills in that regard, but also in his experiences as somebody who has been Minister of the Environment and knows the environment, the challenges that we face in our natural environment extremely well. So I introduce with great pleasure my friend, the Honorable Jonathan Wilkinson.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Hello, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. I spend much of my time in my role as Canada's Minister of Natural Resources talking about the economic opportunities that can be enabled through a transition to a low-carbon future. I often say, and I will repeat today, that there is perhaps no country in the world that is better positioned to take advantage of these opportunities than is Canada. The current federal government has been and is working hard to ensure that Canada does, in fact, proactively seize these opportunities and becomes a clean energy and technology supplier of choice to a net zero world. As we address the existential threat that is climate change, I strongly believe that we can and we must be optimistic with respect to our ability to rise to this challenge, to substantially mitigate carbon emissions, and actually turn it into an economic opportunity. At the same time, we need to address the real and significant costs of climate change that are already baked into our future. These costs are being felt by Canadians, and they will only increase as we move forward. And certainly we are going to need to learn to better adapt to these effects of climate change that, as I say, are already baked in. Les Canadiens ne connaissent que trop bien ces coûts, surtout avec les feux de forêt que nous voyons actuellement à travers le pays. Cette année est historique, mais pas inattendue. Hier, le Canada a franchi un seuil que nous espérions ne jamais atteindre, les incendies de forêt de cette année ont brûlé 7,7 millions d'hectares, ce qui fait officiellement de cette année la pire saison de feux de forêt jamais enregistrée au Canada. And every year, the climate continues to change. Extreme weather events cause immense damage around the world. We certainly have seen it here in Canada over the last number of years, from the Fort McMurray fires to Hurricane Fiona, from droughts and crop losses in the prairies to flooding in Ontario and Quebec. And of course, risks to infrastructure of many types due to the melting of permafrost in the north. It is undeniable that these events are increasing in severity and in frequency because of climate change. Experts predict that by 2025, losses will rise to $25 billion, soaring to between $78 and $101 billion annually each century. That is why the work that Minister Guilbeault has led on Canada's National Adaptation Strategy is so very important. L'année dernière, le gouvernement du Canada a publié le tout premier projet de stratégie nationale d'adaptation, établissant pour la première fois une véritable orientation nationale pour la préparation aux événements liés au changement climatique dans l'ensemble du pays. Nous avons également publié le plan d'action pour l'adaptation du gouvernement fédéral. Aujourd'hui, comme l'a annoncé la ministre Guilbeault, nous publions la stratégie nationale d'adaptation finalisée. I am here today for a couple of reasons. First, as a minister from British Columbia, I am very much aware of the effects that climate change have had on many British Columbians, and those that we continue to see even today with the forest fires. The floods and wildfires that have become a regular occurrence in this province pose a threat to the health and to the safety and to the future of all British Columbians. But I am also here as Canada's Minister of Natural Resources, a department which contributes significantly to the national adaptation effort. The work that we are doing with respect to FireSmart to help to enable communities to protect themselves. The work that we are doing to provide equipment funding for provinces and territories to help them in the work that they are doing each and every day right now to address the forest fire effort. The training of additional firefighters with pilots in Indigenous communities that are already underway. And of course, working very hard to make buildings across Canada more resilient to the impacts of climate change, which is a key part of this effort. We are also working to improve the data we use to predict climate change-induced events. To that end, today, I am pleased to highlight that the Government of Canada is investing $164 million from Budget 2023 through the National Adaptation Strategy to advance the ongoing flood hazard identification mapping program. This investment provides 5 years of additional funding towards projects under the program while working to advance nationwide flood mapping coverage and to share accessible flood hazard information with all Canadians. In the face of the climate crisis, Canada and the rest of the world must take bold steps to reduce carbon emissions. However, increasingly, we must also be focused on adaptation. The impact of climate change is upon us, and we are seeing that very much this year. Together, we must work to make our communities more resilient to these impacts. The National Adaptation Strategy represents an important step forward in doing exactly that. I would certainly want to thank Ministers Guilbeault and Blair for their leadership on this file, and I certainly look forward to continuing our work together. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Minister Wilkinson. You know, it's often said that it requires, good policy making and good leadership requires different walks of life and people who have different experiences to come together. We have, of course, Minister Guilbeault, who has been a thought leader, and am I allowed to call you an activist? An activist in the world of ensuring that we address and deal with climate change in a meaningful way. We have, of course, Minister Wilkinson, who has spent his lifetime as a clean tech CEO, and now my dear friend Minister Blair, who has truly a lifetime of public service under his belt as somebody who has been a first responder, somebody who has been in law enforcement and has now served as a public servant for a very long time. And he's, of course, the minister that is responsible for emergency preparedness, making sure that the challenges that Minister Guilbeault and Minister Wilkinson referred to, that we have a plan to address those on the ground. And he is the person that we see when something goes wrong. He is the first person here to make sure that everybody knows the federal government is there to support all the efforts in ensuring that we build for a better future. So with that, the Honourable Bill Blair.
Thank you very much, Talib, for that very kind invitation. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. I'd like to begin by thanking the elders for their very important words, and which it helps us get to an important announcement, but in a very good way. And as we gather here today, on this beautiful day, a sunny day with clear blue skies, I know that all of our thoughts are with those who are being affected by wildfires here in British Columbia and across Canada. And I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge our gratitude for the firefighters, for the first responders, search and rescue personnel, emergency managers, and all of those members in our communities who are battling these fires and supporting evacuation efforts. As of today, there are currently 492 wildfires burning across Canada, and 258 of those fires are deemed out of control. There have been approximately 7.7 million hectares of forest burned so far this year. And unfortunately, that makes 2023 Canada's worst wildfire season on record. Tens of thousands of Canadians have been forced from their homes since the start of the season due to fires or to poor quality of their air from smoke. And many remain displaced as fire risk remains very high or extreme in many parts of our country. But what we have witnessed so far this year must strengthen our resolve to take action and to enhance community strength so that we can move from disaster risk to resilience. The release of the National Adaptation Strategy today marks an important step in that process. And since we announced the first iteration of the strategy last November, updates and improvements have been informed by input from key partners, including national Indigenous organizations, provinces, territories, and municipalities, many of whom are already leading the way on important adaptation actions. The goals, objectives, and targets outlined in the strategy reflect the shared priorities between all orders of government, and the path sets forward not only long-term goals, but also near and medium-term targets to help every region and every community achieve them. The measures in the strategy, which builds upon our emergency management strategy, are not just about building back stronger and adapting to the way of the world which has already evolved. They are also about preparing for our future. And that means investing in disaster preparedness, protecting nature and restoring biodiversity, and building stronger roads, bridges, sewers, and other critical infrastructure. And that can take the form of mitigation efforts like those the Government of Canada is currently developing, including a low-cost national flood insurance program, strengthening the national public alerting system, and important work to advance national public safety broadband network. Initiatives like these can help us to reduce the impacts of disasters like wildfires, flooding, hurricanes, and extreme heat, by maintaining readiness and being better equipped to respond and to facilitate recovery. Canada also has an opportunity to be a global leader when it comes to adaptation. And we've been working very closely with the United Nations Global Platform on Disaster Risk Reduction and regional partners throughout the globe as we work to identify, prepare for, and adapt to our risks. Later this week, on June 30th, we will mark 2 years since the devastating wildfires that tore through the village of Lytton. And the fire resulted in 2 tragic deaths and burned 90% of the infrastructure of that town here in beautiful British Columbia. The community is building back, and the federal government has provided $77 million in funding to help them with the construction of fire-resistant buildings and supports for homeowners to rebuild fire-resistant standards. Those new building codes, those new standards will help that community as it rebuilds to build back stronger, more resilient, and safer for the residents who will return to that community. And by taking action today, we will strengthen our communities and support their overall health and well-being. And together we can build lasting resilience in the near term and most importantly for generations to come. Thank you very much. Merci. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Blair, for those words and for your ongoing support of all of us here in British Columbia. Before I move on to our next speaker, I also want to acknowledge this is an effort that is supported by all of us in our caucus, and my colleague Parm Baines, the MP for Steveston Richmond, is here with us as well. Welcome, Parm. As I mentioned earlier, this is an effort that requires all levels of government to work together. And we are very grateful to have an excellent partner in the government of British Columbia. And it's my pleasure now to introduce and invite my neighbor and our very good friend, the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change Strategy of British Columbia, the Honourable George Heyman.
Merci beaucoup, Taleb. Bonjour tout le monde. Thank you, Ministers Wilkinson, Guilbeault, and Blair. And thank you, Sequoia, and Chief Sparrow has had to leave us, but thank you for welcoming us to the ancestral and unceded homelands of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. As you've heard, as we all know, climate change is posing significant and severe risks to people's health, to our environment, to our economy, and British Columbia has been very significantly impacted by climate change disasters already and continues to be. Unprecedented wildfire seasons, flooding from atmospheric rivers, heat domes, and the impacts are escalating, and unfortunately, we can expect them to continue to escalate. And people, our citizens, are counting on us to keep them and their families safe. After the events of 2021, we sat at a disaster recovery table co-chaired by Minister Blair. I was there along with some of my colleagues. Minister Guilbeault was there. Indigenous leaders were there. And we talked about what we could do to help British Columbians recover from the flooding. But at the same time, we talked about the climate preparedness and adaptation strategy that British Columbia was working on, and the climate adaptation strategy that Canada was working on. And we also talked about how critically important it was that it be done in collaboration with Indigenous peoples, relying on Indigenous peoples' knowledge and experience. We know it's absolutely critical that we take strong action now to reduce future impacts. That's why British Columbia created a standalone ministry dedicated to emergency preparedness and climate response. Canada's new National Adaptation Strategy is a great step. It's a concrete plan with goals, with objectives, and with targets, and we look forward to working with you and with First Nations to make this a reality for communities around our province. And in doing so, we need to learn from past emergencies, we need to build our capacity to be more resilient, and we need, of course, to mitigate the risks of future emergencies. Our new Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness, led by my colleague, Minister Bowen Ma, isn't just about responding to and recovering from emergencies. We're also taking active measures to prepare for and reduce the risks of disasters. We need to understand how climate change is driving those risks and where the most severe risks exist so we can prioritize our preparedness to meet those risks. Since 2017, British Columbia has funded more than 1,600 disaster risk reduction projects, totaling more than $190 million in provincial funds. We've invested $369 million in the Community Emergency Preparedness Fund. This fund will support Indigenous and local governments in preparing for and mitigating disaster risk. And as Minister Guilbeault and Minister Wilkinson have also mentioned, and we all know, we need to, at the same time, as we're preparing our communities and our citizens to be resilient and ready for the challenges, the risks, the dangers, the threats of climate change, we need to do everything possible to reduce emissions now so that the future is not worse. In BC, our plan is called Clean BC, our climate action plan to lower emissions and create a healthier, low-carbon economy that is synchronized with climate action. Tackling climate change also means there will be more job opportunities in clean energy, in clean tech, and in electrification. In BC, we expect more than 1 million jobs will become available over the next 10 years, and we know that we want those jobs to be low carbon, and we want those jobs to contribute to protecting our communities against climate change. We recently announced our new energy action framework, which will regulate emission reductions from industry, from the oil and gas sector, to meet our important sectoral targets, without which we cannot meet our legislated targets. We need to ensure that every sector in British Columbia fits within our climate commitments to British Columbians. And the new Energy Action Framework will also fund new opportunities in clean energy like hydrogen, renewable electricity, and the clean technologies needed to accelerate decarbonization. I want to thank the federal government for this important step forward. I want to thank First Nations in BC and Canada for the work that has been done with our governments to address the climate challenge together. It's great and important to be here to share and work together on our shared priorities. We can be leaders in a clean, low-carbon future. We can build a stronger, more resilient Canada as well as communities around our nation. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Minister Heyman. As you say, we can be leaders, and I think we all know that we need to be leaders in this regard. As we said before, this does take all levels of government. I think this is the second time in a year we are here at City Hall in Vancouver making an announcement that is related to the fight against climate change. And it's a testament to the importance, I think, that the City of Vancouver places on this issue, to see councillors from all political stripes here today, most ably represented by someone I've spent a lot of time this weekend with at a variety of different events, the acting mayor for the month of June here in Vancouver, Mike Klassen.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Tilly. We have been seeing a lot of each other lately. A thank you to Ministers Guilbeault, Wilkinson, Blair, and Heyman for all being here today, and thank you to Chief Sparrow and Councillor Sequalia for your words. I'd like to acknowledge that we did have quite a bit of City Council here, but they all got chased into the Council chamber because we didn't have quorum. I'm here to represent Mayor and Council. So we're very proud to be a part of today's event to celebrate the National Adaptation Strategy. And on behalf of Vancouver City Council and City of Vancouver, it's my pleasure to welcome you all here to City Hall to today's announcement. Climate change is not a far-off challenge. For many across the country and indeed around the world, it's a daily reality. Unseasonable conditions, extreme weather events, and their impacts have become increasingly common in recent decades. In Vancouver, we experienced the impacts firsthand 2 years ago today, June 27th. This is when the heat dome was ravaging our community. Temperatures in the low to mid 40s that we've never experienced here before, and a lot of us still feeling the trauma from that time. We had sweltering temperatures that resulting from the heat dome that claimed the lives of over 600 British Columbians, and mostly elderly and vulnerable British Columbians, and 117 in the city of Vancouver alone lost their lives. Later that same year, an atmospheric river delivered over 500 millimeters of rain to the Fraser Valley, resulting in extreme flooding that cut off all highway connections to the lower mainland and disrupted our supply chain. And frequent air quality advisories due to wildfire smoke have impacted our access to the outdoors and increased health risks for many, which is why we know this. Investing in climate adaptation today is not only prudent, it's the right thing to do to protect us from climate extremes. It will help preserve health and safety of our communities now, and it will protect future generations. Vancouver has already taken steps to bolster our climate resiliency. We're increasing green infrastructure to capture rainfall and reduce flooding. Our park board is working to increase tree canopy through its urban forest strategy. We're adding cooling and filtration to new buildings and retrofitting our existing buildings by adding more low-carbon emitting systems to keep homes comfortable year-round. We're establishing cooling centers and civic buildings to protect the health and safety of residents during heat extremes and poor air quality events. We're also partnering with Vancouver Coastal Health, BC Housing, social and not-for-profit housing operators to provide additional supports like cool kits for their residents. These are all vital steps that have improved our city's livability and will ultimately create savings for taxpayers in the future. And while we're proud of our leadership, Vancouver has demonstrated in response to climate change, we cannot go it alone when it comes to making our city more climate resilient.
That's why it's wonderful to see all levels of government coming together on the National Adaptation Strategy. These combined investments will spark innovation in technology, industry, and our economy, protect and increase our urban green space, increase our tree canopy, and minimize the impacts of street, property, and shoreline flooding. Investments and proactive policies will help protect our infrastructure that makes our neighborhoods livable, while safeguarding residents, especially those that are most vulnerable. And I'm confident, just as I know Mayor Sim is confident, that this announcement will be an important step towards a better, more climate-resilient future. We look forward to working with the Government of Canada, Province of British Columbia, and with Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations partners to make our region, province, and our country more resilient in the face of the changing climate. Thank you.
Thank you, Acting Mayor Klassen. Well, that brings to the end. The formal portion of today's event. I want to thank everyone very much for attending. We will now have a media availability. I'm going to turn it over to Caitlin Power. Where is Caitlin to take over from here?
Hello. Merci pour cette annonce et merci.